Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 11. Today, we will be discussing organizational processes. So, this is our little overview for today. I did not make any of the textbook readings required. The only required reading I had was the Forces for Good book. That is because that is due on April 13th, so it's due at the end of this week. So I wanted to make sure that everyone had time to finish up that book and write their paper. However, I do have that the chapters from this week related to the lecture will be chapters 5, 8, and 10 from the Furman and Geibelman textbook. So I don't have those required, but those are the chapters that we will be dealing with. Should anyone have any questions related to them? So our activity this week is a case study, reflection from the book, and then again, the assignment we have due this week is the Forces for Good book or the paper. So I just wanted to provide a little feedback from some of our past assignments. We had a few activities that were kind of looking at the financial background and how we kind of determine whether a nonprofit is effective. So many people kind of raise the point that nonprofits are potentially overly scrutinized. That was one of the points in the TED Talk that we watched, that nonprofits are a bit overly scrutinized, that we focus so heavily on their nonprofits and how much money is spent that we're not really focusing on outcomes. So I just kind of wanted to touch base on that. We obviously, the last activity that we had was looking at the finances of nonprofits. I do agree that there is an extent to which we can only scrutinize nonprofits so far. We cannot fully understand what's going on in a nonprofit, but I definitely want to make sure that you guys do understand how we are able to hold nonprofits accountable. I do think it's important to be aware of different measures of organizational effectiveness. And there's definitely things that we should be aware of. Obviously, if a nonprofit's only spending 50% of its money on program expenses, that's probably a problem. If they're supposed to be spending 65% or more, you should be at least aware of what some of these targets are. Obviously, when we are making funding decisions, we should not be making them on these financial ratios alone. That is a point that multiple people brought up, which I completely agree with. For the charity review assignment that was due yesterday or this past Thursday, depending on when you watch this, many people brought up that we needed to consider other factors, which I completely agree with. So we were looking at both how fundraising expenses were being utilized and also how program funding was being utilized. So how much money we were spending on fundraising, how much money we were spending on programs. It definitely provides you with an insight into the organization, but there's so much more to consider when we're determining whether a charity is effective and how we want to be donating our money. So it's also important to know, how the money was being spent, because obviously one program expense at one nonprofit is going to be different than a program expense somewhere else. So it could be that a nonprofit spending $1,000 in if we were looking at two nonprofits that work with adults with developmental disabilities who provide residential services. So maybe that St. Louis Arc is spending $1,000 for the client to have leisure activities, whereas community living was spending $1,000 to provide locks on all of the doors. Those are just two different. That's one example to show how an organization may have $1,000 in program expenses, but really two organizations can spend $1,000 differently, and they would both be counting as program expenses. So we really have no idea how nonprofits are spending their money, and we would definitely want to consider what are the outcomes of the organization. Just because they're spending the same amount of money on program expenses doesn't mean that they have the exact same outcomes. Are they being effective in the amount of money that they're spending? And are they getting the same effectiveness per dollar? Those are both really important to consider. The other thing to consider is so in the assignment, the two organizations, the assignment that we did, Community Living and St. Louis Arc both had similar ratios when it came to the program expenses. I believe St. Louis Arc was spending about 90% of their revenue on or other expenses on programs, whereas community living was at 87%. Very similar. But the fundraising was very different. So St. Louis Arc was spending much less on fundraising to get a lot more money, whereas community living essentially was spending like 50%. Um, they had like a 50% return. So if they for every dollar that they spent on fundraising, they got $2 back. Whereas for St. Louis Arc, it was like they got $8 back, something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers. But something to consider with that is especially if one organization is a lot newer, it's going to take them a lot more time to build up a donor base, a lot more time to work on a grant application. A lot of organizations apply for the same grants over and over and over again. And if you are a brand new organization, it's going to take you time to just develop a grant application. So St. Louis Arc has been around for like since the 1950s. So they have those grant application finished. They have a very good template. They're not starting from scratch on anything. They have a well established donor base. So they can essentially send out a letter for their end of year appeal asking for money, and the money that they're going to get is just going to just kind of pour in for them. Whereas some newer organizations, they're kind of exploring the area. They have to start from scratch on grant applications. If they're seeking for donors, if they send out 1,000 letters for donations, they're kind of just sending them out randomly. They don't know if that money's going to come back to them or not. So that might make it that some more established organizations are much more effective, or it appears that they're more effective in spending their fundraising dollars. But it's more so that they kind of have those processes down in place, ready to go, so it doesn't cost them as much money. So that's always something to consider as well, is just like the age of the organization and that it does take time to develop all of these different practices. But again, we cannot determine our funding or the effectiveness of an organization based solely on these kind of quantifiable numbers. But you definitely do need to consider them, because they do tell at least the background story of what's going on, the base story. And then you're going to have to dig a little deeper from there. Um, but that's just a little feedback from those activities. Um, Thank you for doing those. So, kind of the past few weeks, we've been talking about different structures of organization, financial structures, government structures. So we kind of understand, how do organizations spend their money? How are they governed? How are different processes kind of set in place? But what's important to know is, how do organizations ensure that their mission is being carried out effectively? Essentially, if you have a large organization, you have these um, top people, the executive director, board of directors, who are kind of figuring out, what's our mission statement? What kind of programs and services do we want to be providing? What level of quality do we want to be providing? But when you have, let's say, a staff of 100, the services that are being provided by direct support staff. So these are people who are very low on the totem pole, very, very far away from the board of directors. So you have to have processes in place to ensure that what is happening at the top is what they're saying is trickling down to the bottom. It's kind of like playing a game of telephone, where you kind of, one person starts with a message and you whisper it in someone's ear, and you keep whispering the message. And by the time you get to the 10th person, you have an entirely different message. And that's what happens in nonprofits as well. The president of the board of directors might relay something to the members of the board. It's going to be tweaked a little bit as it's kind of going down that chain of commands. So you have to make sure that you have these effective policies to make sure that you have an effective mission and effective programs. So there's a variety of processes that organizations kind of have in place to ensure effectiveness. These include providing staff with supervision and training, evaluating staff on a regular periodic basis, and also having clear organizational policies. So we'll go through each of these 4 things. So the first is workplace supervision. So for anyone who's worked at a nonprofit or any business, you know that you have a supervisor who you report to. And it is important that you have a relationship with your supervisor and that you are meeting with your supervisor on a periodic, regular basis, so that you are getting direct feedback from your supervisor. You're getting as much support and education as possible from your supervisor, and having these continuous regular meetings between the supervisor and their supervisee is really important to ensure that staff are competent and that they're effective. This is essentially an opportunity for the supervisor to sit down with their staff, typically individual or as a group. Organizations kind of do things a little differently, so it just really depends on the organization, but they really need these periodic meetings so they can touch base on what are the services you are delivering, how are you delivering them. This is typically the main opportunity that staff have to discuss problems with their supervisor. So maybe it's a problem with a specific client, or maybe a problem in how something's being implemented. This is the opportunity for staff to be able to relay that to their supervisor. So supervisor can have that direct feedback. If you're not having these regular meetings with your supervisor, you're probably not informing staff, the supervisor, of problems either. So the supervisor needs to be aware of that. The supervisor should be an individual who has more experience and more education than their supervisees. So they're providing them with a little additional knowledge. There's a lot of research that shows that the more times an individual meets with their supervisor, the more regular that they're meeting with them, the more supported they feel and the less turnover there is. Obviously, in human service organizations, staff have really high burnout rates. They have compassion fatigue, so they get really kind of worked up in with the clients that they're working with. The client problems become their problems. And just really high rates of turnover. But when they have a very supportive supervisor, someone they can go to with problems and support them with the problems, then they are less likely to develop burnout and kind of move on to a different field or position. So it's really important that this is happening. Depending on the organization, some supervisors meet with their supervisees on a weekly basis. It might be every other week. The more the better, and it just is going to vary based on the time of the supervisor and how many people they have below them that they have to be meeting with. But essentially, having a supervisor supervisee relationship is how the organization maintains their hierarchical structure. So if we think about the hierarchy that we kind of looked at a few weeks ago, you have your board of directors and the president of your board of directors. They are the supervisor for the executive director, so they should be meeting. The supervisor might have different program level managers that they meet with. The program level managers have direct support staff. So everyone should be in that hierarchy. Everyone should be meeting. So CEO is going to meet with the president of the board of directors. Managers are going to meet with the CEO. Direct staff are going to meet with their individual managers. So there's going to be problems at each of these different hierarchy levels. And it's important that all of these levels are really communicating with one another. This is also an opportunity to hold people accountable for what they're doing, making sure that staff are aware of what are their responsibilities and that they are carrying all of these out. And just, again, to make sure that they are being as effective as possible and that the mission that is being set by the board of directors is actually being carried out by the direct service staff. Training and development is an additional process that organizations have in place to maintain effectiveness. So there's a variety of different types of training that individuals at an organization are provided with. At the start, an individual should be provided with an orientation. So on your first day, the first week, you are sitting down with either your manager or the HR rep, preferably both, to discuss different aspects of the organization. So that's when you're going to be getting a background on the operating procedures of the organization, what's the agency mission, getting a clearly articulated understanding of your job, getting that written out in a job description, but also having an understanding of what are your responsibilities and your duties. I think this sounds like a no-brainer to a lot of people, but you would be surprised by how much this does not happen in a lot of organizations. People are really busy in human service agencies. People are kind of pushed to the max. I've worked at human service agencies where people did not get a proper orientation just because the supervisor was way too busy. So they didn't know exactly what they were supposed to be doing. So they were essentially thrown into working with clients and they didn't really know what they were supposed to be working with the clients. So it really is important that they're being provided with a thorough orientation, sitting down with their supervisor, and on the job orientation is also extremely helpful. So this might be a situation where they maybe shadow their supervisor for a day to truly understand exactly what they are supposed to be doing. Um, Agencies should also, a lot of agencies have in-service training. So this may be something that they hold on a monthly basis. So when I worked at a human service agency, I all of the staff met once a month and we had a different workshop that we went to them each month. This was typically an opportunity to keep staff aware of different agency policies. So maybe this is an update on our benefits. One time we had an update on what are our benefits, but also keeping staff up to date on different accreditation requirements. So we talked about accreditation last week or the week before that. But essentially, like the Council on Accreditation, which accredits Child and Family Services, they require the agency staff to complete annual HIPAA training, annual child and elder abuse law reporting requirements to be updated on that on an annual basis. So there's certain trainings that people have to stay up to date on, and having these in-service trainings is an opportunity to make sure that staff are staying up to date with their requirements. Continuing education is also an opportunity. A lot of people who have licensure requirements have to do continuing education. So if you decide to get your LCSW down the road, you would have to do continuing education. So continuing education is provided offsite, so it wouldn't necessarily be provided at your agency, but your work should be supporting you to get continuing education, either financially, paying for the continuing education workshops, or providing you with time off to attend continuing education workshops. So a lot of these are just providing staff with new knowledge, keeping staff up to date on research, new procedures in the field, what's going on. Because obviously, what you learned when you were in social work school, things might be a little different 10 years later. So, just staying up to date on kind of what's the most effective policies and procedures. So, all of these trainings, again, just like supervision, having all of this training available for staff really does reduce staff burnout, compassion fatigue. It keeps staff knowledgeable on the best practices, and it just anything to maintain the effectiveness of staff and reduce staff turnover is always going to be beneficial. There are also performance evaluations that should be conducted. Again, just another way to ensure that the mission of the organization is being carried out effectively. So, performance evaluation should preferably be conducted at least once a year. I was in a position where I was not um, evaluated for like 6 years, which is not good. But I was in a different position where I was evaluated every 6 months. So it's really going to vary based on the organization, but at minimum, some people should be evaluated every single year. So this is an opportunity to assess the employee on their job performance. This is a time for the supervisor to sit down with their supervisee. A lot of organizations have individuals complete self-assessment, so you can kind of determine how am I doing on a series of different competencies. This is a good time, again, at the end of the year to establish goals for yourself. What do you want to accomplish in the next year? You can detail achievements you've completed the past year, but also look at what are some shortcomings of you as a service worker, and how can we develop an action plan to correct those shortcomings. So having these annual evaluations is really just a good check-in. Let's review your job description. Are these responsibilities really feasible? What do you need from me as a supervisor or from the agency to maintain this effectiveness? So you really need to be reevaluating this every year to maintain that effectiveness and make sure that you're you don't have outstanding needs. If there's a way that you can make something a little easier, make sure that you're communicating that with your supervisor. And then we also have a variety of organizational policies to keep in mind. With that, I will say our word of the week is coffee, like what some people drink. I do not drink it, but other people do. So that's our word of the week, coffee, COFFEE. Organizational policies. So these need to be clearly articulated. A lot of times organizations have an employee handbook. In this large employee handbook, there are a variety of policies that are really clearly articulated so individuals know what's expected of them, what are the procedures for XYZ. If different situations happen, who do I go to? How is it addressed? All of these need to be clearly established to make staff aware, make them feel supported, and just ensure that what's going on, what the board of directors thinks going on, is actually, again, going on. So a variety of policies. There can be personnel policies. So it might be looking at dress code. Dress code should be clearly articulated. Really anything to give staff more information on what's expected of them. So dress code is a big thing. Do we have casual Fridays? Is every day a casual Friday? Which is in some cases how it is at a human service agency. You don't want staff showing up in jeans on a Monday and then get yelled at by their supervisor. That leads to staff not being very happy because they didn't realize that was against company policy. So you have to keep people aware of these policies. What are employment policies? How much notice does an employee need to give the organization when they're leaving? Can individuals be terminated at will for really no reason? There's also going to be like financial policies that need to be clearly articulated. How can you get reimbursement for business expenses? It can even be some organizations, again, everything is going to vary depending on who you're working with. But if you're working directly one-on-one with clients, maybe your organization has some funds available to help the client with basic needs. Uh, can you spend an unlimited amount of money for the client? Can you spend maybe $200, $50? What's kind of those policies that the organization has put in place? Anything to make the staff more aware of what's expected of them and what is the norm. On-call policies. So for some staff, maybe you're a mental health counselor. When you check out at 5 p.m., are you actually checked out, or are you going to be on call 24/7? I worked at one agency where my coworkers were literally on call 24/7, whereas other agencies, people take shifts of being on call. So if they have a problem, let's say there's 5 social workers who all have about 10 different clients. I, as a mental health counselor, am going to be on call 1 day a week. And that means any of my coworkers' clients can call me that day of the week. So it gives my coworkers a break time. Whereas another organization I worked with, my coworkers were essentially in charge of their clients 24/7. So if their client had a problem, their client called them. Probably not the best policy if we're looking at burnout. Individuals should be able to turn their phone off at some point in their life. But these are different policies that should be well established. The organization really had no on-call policy in place. So staff really didn't know what was expected of them, and staff were kind of doing different things. They got a little cranky on Sundays because people were calling them. So having those clearly articulated is really important. A lot of organizations have like sexual harassment and drug use policies clearly outlined. Again, sexual harassment should be a no-brainer that it's not allowed in the workplace, but it's important for them to have a clear policy in place, primarily to look at reporting of sexual harassment. What are maybe the consequences, the legal and the organizational consequences for sexual harassment, but having those in place, like if I'm sexually harassed in the workplace, what do I do? Do I contact HR? Do I contact the police? What should I be doing as an employee? Same with drug use. So some organizations do mandatory drug testing. Some do periodic testing, some do no drug testing. So having that clearly outlined is also really important. Also clearly outlined what's considered a conflict of interest. So if you are working with a client, what would be considered a conflict of interest? So I, as a mental health worker, should probably not be providing counseling to my sister or my niece. That would be considered a conflict of interest because it is a relative of mine. But those should be clearly, again, clearly articulated. A lot of social workers work multiple jobs. That is very common in social services. I did it. I was working a full-time job and I was working a part-time job on the side, both in social services, but two very different fields. So it was not considered a conflict of interest. My organization did have a conflict of interest um, statement clearly articulated. So I did have to complete a form. I had outside employment, so I completed an employment form to document that I did have outside employment, but because they were separate, it was fine, and I was able to maintain that. Whereas my supervisor, um, she was supervising mental health workers, but then she also had private practice on the side. And at one point, um, there were some overlapping clients, so she had to quit seeing one client because it developed a conflict of interest. But because they had clearly articulated policies in place on conflict of interest, she regularly met with their supervisor to discuss the conflict of interest. They were able to work through those, so it did not become a problem, luckily. But having all of these, again, clearly articulated, spelled out in a handbook that is easily accessible to staff and provided to staff is really important. So staff is aware of their responsibilities and what's expected of them. Because when you have effective processes, you have more effective and you have happy staff. Happy staff in social work is always positive. It's always something you want to strive for. And hopefully happy staff leads to effective staff. But again, social work has such a high turnover. People get burned out easily depending on the field that you're in. Some fields have more turnover than others. Being a foster care case manager is a tough job, and if you do not have very specific procedures and processes in place, if you're not feeling completely supported by your supervisor, you're not being provided with effective training, you're not going to be very happy, and then you're probably not going to be very effective. I think we can all understand that if you're not happy, you're probably not being very effective either. So we have to make sure that we have effective processes to maintain effective services. So that is our lecture for this week. I tried to keep it short because we do have a paper due at the end of this week. So our activity this week is a case study reflection. So this is looking at a little case study called Pay Inequality. It's on page 158 to 159 of our Navigating Human Services book, the Furman book, Geibelman and Furman book, that little blue book that everyone should have. If people do not have the book, you will not be able to complete this assignment. I am happy to provide you with a copy of the case study. I just need to be informed of that. This is your opportunity to let me know that you either don't have the book or you have an old version of the book, so you are going to need a copy of the case study, which is fine. I was a student. I did not purchase every single textbook. You just need to inform me of that. If anyone needs a copy of the case study, I don't want you to be not able to complete this assignment because you don't have the book. So please let me know if you don't have the book, and I can print you off a copy and email it to you. But essentially, you're going to read this case study, and how would you react? What's your thoughts based on the case study? So read it over. Give me a one-page reflection. I'm not looking for anything major. I just want to make sure that you guys are reading it. But it should be fairly simple. Your Forces for Good paper is due as well. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because we have our Forces for Good paper due on the 13th of April. That is coming up. After that, 2 weeks after that, we have our community meeting reflection, which is due on April 27th. I can't say this enough. If you have not gone to a community meeting or you do not have a date picked out, get on it. Most community meetings only meet once a month, so you're running out of time because you've probably already missed the first one if it meets on the first Monday of the month. 2 weeks after the community meeting reflection is due, we have our final paper due, which is on May 11th. This semester is flying by. We only have a month left. So in the next month, essentially in the next month, we have a month and 4 days left of the semester. We have essentially have 3 papers due. So Forces for Good paper is due on the 13th, community reading reflection is due on the 27th, and then the final paper is due May 11th. So again, just a little reminder, Forces for Good paper. It's 5 to 7 pages, double spaced. Hopefully you've read the book by now. There's 6 practices of high impact nonprofits. You're going to be selecting 3 of those practices, so 3 of the 6 practices that the book discusses, and you're going to apply them to an actual nonprofit for whom you've had experience. So maybe that you volunteered, did an internship, or you were an employee at a nonprofit, and you're going to discuss different ways that the nonprofit did or did not carry out this practice. So one of the practices is make markets work. So it's discussing how nonprofits need to involve for-profit corporate businesses into their inner workings, either as volunteers or donors. So maybe you can talk about how I could talk about how the organization I work at, we involve businesses as donors, but we don't really involve them as volunteers, and we probably should do a little better at that. So that's something that I could lay out a little more. So if we're looking at a 5 to 7 page paper, roughly you're going to be spending 2 pages per practice. You have 3 practices. Roughly, on average, it's going to be about 6 pages, 2 pages per practice. Should be fairly easy, I hope. If anyone has any questions on the Forces for Good paper, please let me know. And again, if anyone needs a copy of the case reflection, let me know, and I'm happy to provide that as well. Thank you all. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend. It's supposed to be warm where most of us are. I will see you all next week. Thanks.